Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Hearing his wife laughing at him turned everything upside down for him. Today's story has a similar plot. Enjoy watching it. Lionel Hawkins felt the car he was in stop, but he had no idea where he was. Just a minute ago, he was working at home, and now he was pilled, tied up, gagged, blindfolded, and thrown into the trunk of what seemed to him like a quite expensive car. As he began to regain consciousness, he was shaking and suspected that he was being taken to some distant place. But where? And why? The thought that he might be killed twisted his stomach into knots. He heard the trunk lock click, and he was pulled out and thrown to the ground. He thought he would soon be shot in the head, but the expected shot never came. Instead, he heard the laughter of two men, but the real blow to his stomach was the laughter of a third person. It was a woman's laugh, but not just any woman. It was Cheryl, his wife, the woman he had loved for over 10 years. "Why don't we just end him right here?" he heard the voice of one of the men. "No, no," replied his wife. "Between the heat and the snakes, he will soon die. I don't want to leave anything that could lead the police to us. Besides," the other man added, "it would be years before anyone would find him here. By then, only bones will remain." They both laughed again. He heard his wife move and then smelled her perfume as she sat down next to him. "Sorry it ends like this, honey," she said sarcastically while the other two laughed. "But you knew it wouldn't last forever. Besides, Enrique and his people have better intim than you ever could." This caused even more laughter. "Believe it or not, it's nothing personal, it's just business." "Oh, who am I kidding?" "Of course it's personal," she chuckled, then stood up. "Untie his hands," she ordered the two men. "Are you sure?" asked the first man. "Yes," she replied. "Leave his feet tied and blindfolded." She sat down next to her husband again. "Now be a good boy and count to 100 after we leave, before you untie yourself and remove the blindfold. Understood?" Lionel nodded, unable to say anything due to the gag in his mouth. She stood up again. "Do it," she ordered. Lionel felt one of the men cut the zip ties that bound his hands behind his back. "You're lucky, cuckold," the man whispered. "If it were up to me, I'd shoot you in the damn brains and then feed you to the fish." When his hands were free, he rubbed his wrists. The man left him and got back into the car. Lionel heard his wife's voice for the last time. "Now be a good boy and do as I say," she said. "Otherwise, I'll have to unleash my dogs on you." I would say it was nice, but that would be a lie. "So do humanity a favor and die." "Okay, well done," she laughed and slammed the door. He cried when he heard the car drive away. He counted to 100 as she instructed and then removed the blindfold and gag. He squinted until he got used to the bright light and looked around at the harsh desert landscape. He realized that he would not last long in the open air. He untied his legs and took off his shirt and jacket, tying his shirt over his head to somehow protect himself from the unbearable heat. He could barely make out the tracks of the car that had brought him there and decided to follow them as far as he could. As he walked, he reflected on his life with Cheryl. They had met in law school, dated, fallen in love, and gotten married. Both worked for a large law firm, but he felt his talents were not being utilized there. After all, he didn't go to law school to become rich. He sincerely wanted to help people. So, 3 years after graduating, he started his own firm, devoting at least 10% of his time to providing free legal aid to those who needed it but couldn't afford it. Cheryl helped him whenever she could and seemed to support his work. At first, she admired his energy and willingness to go it alone, taking on big firms in the name of serving the public. But over time, something changed. It turned out that Cheryl was not so concerned about helping people unless she herself benefited from it. Her goal was simple: to become rich and powerful, and not necessarily in that order. While she only pretended to support his startup firm, she talked to influential people in other companies, hoping to get a position as a partner. She eventually landed a position with one of the largest firms in the region and was soon earning much more than he was. She was not ashamed of her new position in life. At her insistence, they separated their bank accounts, and she rarely contributed to paying the bills, even though she earned much more than he did. She bought herself a new BMW while he drove a 5-year-old Toyota, which he repaired himself. Worse, she rarely let him drive her car unless it was to take him to one of her social events, where she would introduce him before disappearing with new colleagues to do God knows what. Her new job also required frequent travel. She often visited New York, Washington, Boston, Miami, Seattle, as well as London and Paris. She even joined her partners on cruises to the Bahamas and the Mediterranean, telling him that married couples were not invited. She had been home less than ever over the past 2 years and had even missed their last 2 anniversaries. She always promised to make up for it, but she never did. Their 10th anniversary was approaching, but this year he decided to do nothing to see if she would notice. So far, she hadn't said a word. He was pretty sure she was cheating on him. Lately, all the signs were there, but he had no concrete evidence, at least nothing that could be presented in court. The worst part was that he couldn't afford to hire a private detective, especially since all his money was going toward maintaining his business and household. Several times, he smelled men's cologne or aftershave on her. He also felt something else on her more than once. Of course, their intimate life had hit rock bottom over the past 2 years. They used to make love several times a week, but now he was lucky if they were together once or twice a month. Even then, it seemed like she was just giving him a quick handout to hold him over until she decided to grace him with her presence again. Things had gotten worse in the last year and a half, but the last 6 months had been the worst. The firm she worked for assigned her to a client who required her to work exclusively with him. She was now traveling all over Latin America. Bogota, Lima, and Mexico City were just a few of her destinations. Along with all the other trips, her mother had immigrated to the States from Costa Rica, so Cheryl was fluent in both Spanish and English. This became an advantage in her new assignment. He knew nothing about this new client except that he was very rich, very influential, and very demanding. He was almost sure that she was having an affair with him on the side, but again, he had no concrete evidence. Not that it mattered much, he knew he would still be persecuted in court. So he waited, deciding that at some point, she would get out of control, and then he would make his move. He had already done everything possible to protect himself and his startup company from her, so all that remained was to wait for the right moment. But he never thought she would do something like this. He wondered what could be the reason and suddenly remembered the documents she wanted him to sign and notarize for her client. She said it was something to do with import and export, but he refused to do anything with the papers, not knowing her client and not knowing what he intended to do with them. Moreover, he wondered if it was legal. Why couldn't she have her company do it? All this seemed too suspicious to him. She even offered him a large sum of cash, real money, much more than would be required to trigger an investigation if he tried to deposit it all at once. She showed him the money that was hidden in a suitcase, and this aroused a lot of suspicion in him. Was she involved in something illegal? Maybe her client was trying to smuggle illegal substances or weapons. His first instinct was to contact the police, but he decided to wait until he knew more. In retrospect, he realized that he should have acted faster. Unfortunately, Cheryl wasn't particularly forthcoming, simply saying that if he couldn't get the simple form done, she'd find someone else who could. However, she said she would give him a chance to reconsider his position. He remembered telling her that he needed more information about her client and his intentions, but she had just snorted at that, saying that he should just trust her. Then there was the day he found a piece of paper stuck between the documents she wanted him to notarize. It had the number 350 written on it next to the initials ACT and a date, along with what looked like GPS coordinates in a man's handwriting. It didn't make any sense to him, so he showed it to one of his colleagues, Andy McGregor. "Let me try to figure out what this all means," Andy said. The next day, Andy came to him and suggested that this could indicate the day and place of delivery for illegal weapons. No, Cheryl couldn't be involved in something like that, he told Andy. "Are you 100% sure?" Andy asked. "After all, you said it yourself. She wants you to certify documents that haven't even been filled out and signed yet. If I were you, I'd go straight to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. I wouldn't waste any time." "Let me talk to Cheryl first," he said. "Thanks for looking at this." "You're welcome, Lionel," Andy said. "But I think you're making a huge mistake by not going to the authorities right away. As it turns out, Andy was right. Not taking action was a mistake. He came home and barely had time to put his briefcase on the table when he felt something. After a few seconds, everything went dark. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his leg and screamed. Looking down, he saw a rattlesnake. He had been so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't even hear the snake hiss. Damn, he thought, looking around. He found a large stone, picked it up, and killed the snake just as it was preparing for another strike. His leg hurt, and he made his way to the Joshua tree, hoping to find some shade. He knew that if he did not get treatment for the bite quickly, he could die. But he had nothing, not even a pocket knife. Cheryl and her henchmen had taken everything from him when they kidnapped him, even his watch and wedding ring. He watched the sun sink below the horizon, realizing that he might not live to see the morning. He felt himself beginning to lose consciousness, and he did something he had not done since he went on a crusade 15 years ago. He prayed. God, please help me. It was already evening, and as was their custom, they were sitting on the back porch with their 9-month-old son, William. I enjoyed this time with my family, remembering the day's events and looking forward to the next. My beautiful wife, Danny, sat next to me with her head on my shoulder as I rocked our son on my lap. She liked to watch me talk to the child in a childish language. It's a good thing no one can hear you now, Amos, she said, laughing. You'd think you were going through your second childhood. I laughed and continued rocking William. He's just a child, I said. You have to have fun with him somehow. At that moment, the doorbell rang. I handed William over to Danny and went to open the door. I was surprised to see my grandfather, Elijah, on the doorstep. As always, he was dressed like a character from an old western, with a long trench coat and a worn-out Stetson. Come in, Grandpa, I said. Long time no see. How are you? He came in and hugged me tightly. As beautiful as a dragonfly in summer, he said, smiling. Just stopping by to visit my grandchildren. They're all in the backyard enjoying the sunset, I said. Come in. Would you like a beer? Of course, he said. We need something to wash away the road dust. I took a beer out of the fridge and walked out onto the back porch to find him already sitting down and rocking little William on his lap, making baby noises that made the baby smile. He took the beer from me and drank half of it before putting the bottle down. See? I said, looking at Danny. I'm not the only one who does this. She laughed. Grandpa Elijah looked at us, confused. What's he doing? He asked. Danny was picking on me for making baby noises when I was with William, I said. He laughed. Well, I did that 100 years before you two were even born, he said. You know, William here looks a lot like your grandfather, Jedediah, at this age. You mean my great-great-great-grandfather? I asked. He nodded. Yes, he said. The same one. He was about the same age when everything went wrong. You mean war? I asked. Yes, he said. The Southerners fired on Fort Sumter, and soon the whole country was embroiled in war, brother against brother. I joined the regiment that was formed in Indianapolis. At first, we were an infantry regiment, but later we became a cavalry regiment. That was the last time your Grandma Lizzie or the children saw me alive. Damn, I said. That was hard. He nodded. Yes, that was it, he said. We went everywhere, Shiloh, Chattanooga, Atlanta, hundreds of other places. I've seen many good people die on both sides. It seemed to me that a tear appeared in his eyes. He wiped his face and turned his attention back to William. I hope you never have to experience anything like this, son, he said quietly. His face suddenly changed. For a few seconds, he stood up and handed William to me. Sorry, but I need to leave. I'll be back soon. Do you have a first aid kit for snake bites or something like that? Of course, I said. Anyone living in these parts would be crazy not to have one, although some argue that these kits can do more harm than good. Luckily, we have a doctor in the area who still does home visits and is known for his promptness. Okay, he said. Get it ready and be ready to call the doctor. He left the house and returned a few minutes later, carrying in his arms a man whose shirt was tied around his head. Grandpa laid him on the sofa and placed his injured leg so that it was below the level of his heart. Danny handed me the first aid kit and called Dr. Thompson while we treated the man's wound. He was still breathing, but it was clear that he was very ill. A few minutes later, Dr. Thompson came to the door, and Danny hurried to show him inside. The doctor was well known to everyone in the area. He was a kind old man who used to work at a hospital in town before opening his practice here. He took one look at the man and immediately knew what to do. He pulled out 2 fresh syringes and 2 small bottles of liquid from his bag, which I assumed were antidotes. He gave the man 2 injections and then gave us anti-nausea pills. "Looks like you made it in time," he said, getting up from his seat. "Keep an eye on him. Don't let him get up, and don't give him food or water for a while. Keep his leg below heart level. If his condition worsens, call me and we can take him to the nearest emergency room. If his face starts to swell or he starts vomiting, call me right away. I'll come in the morning to check on his condition." "Doctor, will he be okay?" I asked. He nodded. "I think so," he said. "The bite looks worse than it is, but keep an eye on it just in case. I've given him a tetanus shot and an antidote, but if his condition worsens, I may need to give him more." "I hate to ask, but do you know if he has insurance?" "I have no idea, doctor," I said. "Listen, I'll pay the expenses. Just send me the invoice." "Well, okay," he said. "Let me know as soon as you get any information about him. Damn government paperwork makes everything much more complicated than it needs to be. By the way, what happened to him?" "They threw him away," said Grandpa. "They left him for dead." "Maybe you should call the sheriff," the doctor said. "The local sheriff won't do anything here," Grandpa said. "Don't worry, he's in good hands." "Well, fine, if you say so," said the doctor. "Keep an eye on him tonight. See you in the morning." We thanked him as he left and then sat back in the living room. "What's going on, Grandpa?" I asked. He took a deep breath before continuing. "His name is Lionel Hawkins. He is an attorney in Southern California. His wife and several of her henchmen ambushed him, took him to Death Valley, and left him for dead," he said. "Did he do something bad?" I asked. Grandpa shook his head. "No," he said. "He is completely innocent, but his wife is another story." He looked at Danny. "Can you find information about someone on your computer?" "Yes," she said. "I still have access to LexisNexis." "What do you need?" "I want all the information I can get on Enrique Castillo and Cheryl Hawkins," he said. "You mean that rich Mexican businessman?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "The same one." "Okay," she said. "And I assume Cheryl Hawkins is this man's wife?" "Yes," Grandpa answered quietly. "Her maiden name is Lindstrom, and she uses it often." "I'll get to it right away," she said. "Besides, it's time to put William to bed, so I'll do that and then get to work." He nodded without saying anything. I knew he was trying to think about something, so I stayed silent for a few minutes. "What are you thinking, Grandpa?" I asked. "I think our friend came across something he shouldn't have seen," Elijah said. "Something big, and now his wife is trying to put all the blame on him to cover up their activities." "What, prohibited substances? Weapons?" I asked. He shook his head. "I'm sure it has something to do with that, but there's more to it than that," Elijah said. "True. I still can't figure out what exactly. Do you think this is something similar to what Mike experienced?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not really," he said. "Lionel's wife wanted him to certify or sign some documents, but he refused. He told her that he did not know her client and did not understand his intentions. Then he accidentally bumped into something right before he was captured. I don't think he even realized what it was. Is this what you're trying to understand?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes," he said. "Unfortunately, Lionel's memories are a little blurry now." "Can you read memories?" I asked. He smiled and nodded slightly. "A little bit," he said. "One of the benefits of the job, perhaps. When he wakes up, I can get a clearer picture." I thought you said you could read a person's face, I said. He nodded. I can, he said. I can tell a lot about a person from their face, but not necessarily everything. The main thing is to look them in the eyes. These are windows into the human mind. I thought about his words for a few minutes before speaking again. How about we go out on the porch, have a beer, and smoke? I suggested. He looked at Lionel for a second, then nodded. Why not? He asked with a smile. Nothing can be done here anyway until he wakes up. We stood up and headed to the back exit, stopping for a moment at the refrigerator to get a couple of bottles. I took out the box of cigarettes he gave me, opened it, and offered him one. He took it, and I took out a match and struck it on my jeans. He took a drag as I lit his cigarette, then lit mine. We stood in the dark, each immersed in our own thoughts. These are the tasks you do, Grandpa, I said. Are they always like mine or Lionel's? No, he said. Most of them are pretty simple, about the same as yours. More often than not, those I help don't even know I was involved. I like it even better this way. But lately, they have become more and more complex, more and more intense. Sometimes it seems to me that people no longer understand the difference between good and evil. Even worse, many people don't seem to care. I see what you mean, I said. Well, Danny and I will do our best to help. I appreciate it, son, he said. It means a lot to me, especially since I don't understand all this new technology. In my day, everything was simpler. I shot the idiot, and that was the end of it. It's not so simple anymore, I said. Speaking of shooting, he began. Yes? I asked. Did you train with that rifle I gave you? He asked. I nodded. The last time I saw him, he gave me a Winchester Model 1892.44-40 rifle with a modified lever. It was designed so that it could be fired by simply cocking the lever once the pin was in place. It worked like those old TV westerns. Of course, I said. But there's one strange thing. What's that? He asked. The damn thing never seems to run out of ammo, I said. He laughed. You've noticed this, haven't you? He asked with a smile. This can be useful in a firefight, trust me. If you take good care of her, she will definitely take care of you. We finished our cigarettes and drank our beers, then went back inside. Danny was waiting for us in the living room, holding several sheets of paper in her hands. I found information about Castillo and Cheryl Lindstrom Hawkins for you, she said. Are you ready to hear what I learned? Of course, Elijah said, sitting down. Okay, she said. First, from what I could find, Cheryl was last employed as an attorney at the firm of Dway and Chatham in Southern California. I'm not sure if she still works there, but Castillo was her last client. She apparently handles all of his legal affairs. She also travels with him often, Mexico City, Bogota, Caracas, even abroad. There are articles on the internet about Castillo, and in many of the photos of him, she looks more like his mistress than a highly paid lawyer. She stopped to hand us a printed photo. Cheryl was a very attractive woman with long dark hair and deep brown eyes. Her Hispanic heritage was easy to spot. She wore a short dress that showed off her slender legs and a fair amount of cleavage. Castillo looked a little older than her and seemed quite sophisticated in his expensive suit. He hugged her, and she seemed to enjoy it. It was obvious that there was chemistry between them. There's something else, Danny continued. Castillo has large villas in Colombia and Mexico. He is also under investigation by Mexican authorities on various charges, prohibited substances, weapons, human trafficking, you name it. However, these investigations were never successful, as they magically disappeared. He also appears to have recently become very active in the politics of the Mexican state of Chihuahua. It is the largest state in Mexico and borders Texas and New Mexico. What do you mean, active? I asked. He seems to be building a coalition to eventually remove the political leaders there, she said. It's not much different from how rich people here in the state support politicians. He has already succeeded in replacing several mayors with politicians loyal to him and has also replaced a number of bureaucrats. People are starting to ask questions. But do you think there's more to it? Grandpa asked. I don't know, she said. It's difficult to judge based on these reports alone. Okay, Grandpa said, taking the stack of papers from Danny's hands. I'll look into it. Thank you very much, Danny. Why don't you young people rest? I'll stay here with Lionel. Are you sure? Danny asked. You need to rest too. He laughed. Don't worry, honey, he said. I don't need sleep anymore. Remember? Sorry, I forgot, she said. He kissed her forehead as she went upstairs. I looked at him before standing up, but he was already studying what Danny had given him. Good night, Grandpa, I said. He raised his head and waved at me. Good night, son, he said. Don't worry about keeping the noise down, he added with a smile. I knew what he meant. Danny could sometimes be very emotional in bed. I smiled and went upstairs. As it turned out, there was nothing to worry about since Danny kept a pillow handy to muffle her screams. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of bacon and coffee and realized that Danny was already up. I went to the bathroom, took a shower, got dressed, and went downstairs. Well, you've finally woken up, sleepyhead, Grandpa said, laughing. Half the day has already passed. I smiled and went to the kitchen to grab a cup of coffee and kiss my wife good morning. I hugged her and rubbed my face against her neck. Damn, this smells good, I said. Thank you, honey, she replied. But you better let me go, otherwise, everything will burn. I kissed her, took the coffee, and went into the living room. William was sitting in his high chair, and Lionel was already conscious but still lying on the sofa. How are you feeling? I asked. He looked at me with bewilderment. My leg hurts like hell, and my back itches, he said. Where am I? Who are you? How did I end up here? Am I all ready? Ready? One question at a time, I said. For starters, no, you are not dead. My name is Amos Jones. The woman making breakfast is my wife, Danny, and this man. Judo peace, said Grandpa, holding out his hand. Lionel shook it and looked carefully at his grandfather. I remember seeing you, Lionel said. You were the one who picked me up in the desert. Grandpa nodded. How did you know where I was? I asked for help, said Lionel. Grandpa smiled. I have answered your call. Lionel remembered his prayer and looked at his grandfather, stunned. You, he began. Grandpa shook his head. No, he said. I'm not even close. So, where am I? Lionel asked. In Texas, I replied. Would you like to have some breakfast? He nodded. Yes, I'm starving, he said. Danny brought him a plate of bacon and eggs and placed it on the coffee table with a coaster. Thank you very much, he said. You're welcome, she replied. Bon appetit. He didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed a fork and ate the food greedily, as if he hadn't eaten for days. Danny brought food for the rest of us, and we ate in silence. She sat with William and fed him while she ate, and when she was done, she put him in the playpen. So, I said when I finished, what can you tell us? How did you end up in Death Valley? Where did I end up? He asked. I nodded. Yes, I said. What happened? The last thing I remember was putting my briefcase on the table at home to look through documents, he said. The next thing I remember is being tied up and thrown into the trunk of a car. The car stopped, and they threw me out. My wife has made it clear that she wants me dead. Oh God, Danny said. What documents were you going to look at? I asked. He shook his head. Just something that Cheryl, that's my wife, by the way, wanted me to certify for her client, he said. This is important, Danny said. What documents? She wanted me to pre-certify and sign documents for some import-export transaction for her client, he said. Wait, Danny said. She wanted you to sign and notarize something that hadn't even been signed or completely filled out yet? She asked, shocked. Basically, yes, he replied. Why? Asked Danny. He shrugged. I don't know, he said. Your wife is a lawyer, right? She asked. He nodded. Yes, he said. Then why couldn't she do it herself if it's so important? Danny asked. He shook his head again. I don't know, he replied. I asked her, but she just waved me off. I told her that I would not do anything until I met with her client and discussed it in person. I also told her that I refused to put my stamp on anything that was not completely filled out and verified. Look, I don't have much, but I have my integrity. I understand, Danny said. She looked at Grandpa and me before speaking again. I smell a huge rat here, she said. Nothing about this makes sense. She turned back to Lionel. Did she offer you money? Oh God, yes, he said. A whole suitcase full of $100 bills. I didn't count, but I knew it was over $10,000. You know what happens when you try to deposit that amount of cash all at once, right? Danny nodded. And I also know what happens if you try to bring it in piecemeal, she said. You didn't accept her, did you? Hell no, he said. I told her straight out that either I would meet with her client in person and get all the information, or there would be no deal. What is your relationship with your wife like now? Danny asked. He laughed out loud. What relationship? He asked. For the last 3 months, I've been lucky if I see her at least 5 days a month. The rest of the time she's at meetings in Mexico City, Acapulco, Bogota, wherever. Even when she's at home, she's either on her phone or on her computer. Do you think she's cheating on you? Asked Danny. I'm confident of it now, he said. I've suspected this for some time, but she was never home, and I couldn't afford to hire a private investigator to check on her. What made you so sure of this now? Asked Danny. Her last words to me, he said. She told me to do humanity a favor and die. One of her goons called me a cuckold, and she admitted to sleeping with other men. I may be a weakling, but I'm not a fool. Danny showed him one of the photos she had printed off the internet. Is this your wife? She asked. He looked at her and nodded. Yes, that's her, he said. Do you know the man she's with? Asked Danny. No, I personally don't know, he said. I'm guessing this is one of her wealthy clients, her only client as far as I can tell. Danny said, his name is Enrique Castillo, and he is one of the richest businessmen in Mexico. No wonder, said Lionel. Enrique comes from the German name Heinrich, which means powerful ruler of the house. The name Castillo translates to castle. This suggests that he is probably a controlling stupid with delusions of grandeur. He looked at us after he said this. Sorry, this is my hobby. I love researching the origins and meanings of names. So it's safe to assume that what she wanted you to assure was related to him, Danny said. Am I right? He nodded slowly. Yes, he said. Maybe it has something to do with that note you found before you were captured, Grandpa said. Before this, he had simply listened, watching Lionel's face and saying almost nothing. Lionel's eyes widened. How do you know about this? He asked. It's his hobby, I said. He reads faces. Lionel looked at us in bewilderment. And he can tell it by my face? He asked. I can tell a lot about a person by his face, said Grandfather. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. I opened it and invited Drawer Thompson to enter. How is our patient this morning? He asked, looking at Lionel. You seem to be feeling a little better. Yes, said Lionel. The doctor nodded and examined his wound. The bite looks much better than yesterday, he said, changing the bandage. Have you eaten yet? Yes, I ate bacon and eggs, said Lionel. The doctor nodded again. Okay, he said. No nausea, dizziness, or anything like that? No, Lionel said, shaking his head. Even better, said the doctor. Well, I guess everything's okay, he added as he finished changing the bandage. Don't put too much weight on that leg for a while and call if you need anything else. How much do I owe? I asked. The doctor waved his hand. Don't worry about it, he said. My assistant will send the bill. Take care of yourself, okay? See you, doctor, Danny and I said as he left. After he left, we turned our attention back to Lionel. You were going to explain something about the note you found, I said. Lionel took a deep breath and exhaled heavily. Yes, there were some numbers in the initial sack, as well as a date and GPS coordinates, he said. Grandfather looked at me. GPS? What is this? He asked. GPS, I said, means Global Positioning System. It's a way to find and track anything on Earth. Oh my God, said Grandpa. What else will they come up with? What do you think it was? I asked. Lionel replied, honestly, I don't know, he said. But you have a guess, right? Grandfather asked. Lionel nodded. Yes, he said. A friend of mine suggested that this could be linked to a possible supply of illegal weapons, but I just can't imagine Cheryl being involved in something so blatantly illegal. Have you ever imagined that your wife would cheat on you and try to get you involved in unethical, if not outright illegal, activities with your notary? Asked Danny. She didn't wait for an answer before she continued. I knew she was in lawyer mode and wouldn't stop until Lionel understood everything himself. Have you ever imagined that your wife would kidnap you, inject you with something, drag you out into the desert, and leave you there to die? She asked, her voice getting angrier. Did you ever imagine that she would literally tell you to do humanity a favor and die? Lionel shook his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. No, he said quietly. I thought she was cheating on me, but I never would have thought about everything else. So is it really too much of a stretch to think that she might be involved in something massively illegal, like the arms trade? Asked Danny. He shook his head again. No, if you put it in that context, not too much, he said. During this exchange, I noticed that my grandfather had closed his eyes, and it seemed that he was communicating with someone, but I did not know who. After Lionel finished, Grandpa opened his eyes and looked at me. Do me a favor, son, he said quietly. Turn on that TV of yours and put it on channel 970. I took the remote and did as he said. We didn't have a channel with that number on our service, so I wondered what we would see. I pressed the button to start recording on the DVR. An image appeared on the screen from the veranda of a luxury home with a bistro table and 2 chairs. Cheryl walked out onto the veranda wearing a short robe that was open in the front. She sat down and was soon joined by a dark-skinned man in a slightly longer robe. A servant brought a tray of cups, and they both took a cup. What are we watching now, Grandpa? I asked. He raised his hand. I'll tell you when it's over, he said. We watched as they took a sip from their cups before speaking. The man said something in rapid Spanish, and a translation appeared on the screen. I see you took care of your stupid hubby yesterday, the translation said. Yes, Cheryl replied in Spanish. I'm sure it was hard for you to get rid of him like that, he said. She shrugged. Not really, Enrique, she said. This has been building up for a long time. This would still have to be done sooner or later. It just saves me time and money on the divorce. Now all his property and business will be mine once he is declared dead. So you didn't love him? Enrique said. She shook her head. No, it's been a while, she said, which brought more tears from Lionel. At first, yes, but he simply did not have the same desire for wealth and power that you have, and damn it, I'm not going to drag someone down because they don't have the ambition to improve their life. And now, he asked. She smiled and took another sip. Now I have you, she said, and he smiled. And I have never been happier or more satisfied. Soon all of the Chihuahuas will be at your feet, he said, and she smiled. As soon as the weapons are delivered, my new army will be ready, and we will strike. You know, my people said they lost track of your husband a few hours after you threw him away. They're still looking but haven't found anything yet. She shrugged. Maybe he fell into a ravine or crawled somewhere and died, she said. Who cares? Besides, where could he go? He didn't even have a comb when I left him, and I didn't see any angels to take him away. Except he's gone now, it's just you and me. He smiled, nodding his head. Yes, it is, isn't it? He asked rhetorically. Suddenly, something distracted him, and he reached into his pocket. He took out his mobile phone and spoke into it. Are you sure about this? He asked. We couldn't hear what was said on the other side of the line. After a few seconds, he responded, Do it now, he ordered before ending the call. What was that? Enrique? Cheryl asked. He smiled and shook his head. A minor administrative detail, he said. You have nothing to worry about. So where are we? You were going to tell me about our future again, she said. Oh yes, he said. First we will take a Chihuahua, then all of Mexico. After this, we will unite all our people under one banner. Then we will move north and join our oppressed brothers and sisters and take back what the gringos stole from us so long ago. This will be a great war, and I will become the Napoleon of the Western Hemisphere. Does this excite you? He asked. Yes, very much, she replied. And I will become your Empress Josephine and be by your side when the corrupt President of the United States is forced to capitulate to you, my king. Am I your king? He asked with a grin. Of course, Enrique, she replied. Always and forever. I want to be your queen and give you heirs. I certainly hope so, he said. You know how I deal with those who betray me. I would never betray you, darling, she said, climbing onto his lap. I am very glad to hear this, my queen, he said. I've had enough, Lionel said. Turn it off, please. The recording ended, and ripples appeared on the screen. I looked at my grandfather. What the hell did we just see? I asked. Where did this come from? I can't explain all the details right now, he said. Let's just say I'm not the only one who does what I do. What you saw actually happened as you saw it. That's all I can say. I don't know how it was done, and I can't explain. You mean we just watched a video of two people somewhere we don't know discussing the revolution and then having intimate, and it's in real time? Asked Danny. Grandfather nodded. Looks like it, he said. He looked back at Lionel. So we need to send you somewhere where they can never find you. But where? Asked Lionel. I think I know a suitable place, said Grandfather. But I suggest taking a bath first. No offense, but you're starting to smell a little. We all laughed, even little William. Yes, but I can't stand on this leg for long, Lionel said. No problem, Danny said. We have a special seat that can be used in the shower. Honey, could you get the seat out of the back cabinet for Lionel? She asked, looking at me. No problem, I said. At the same time, I'll look for clothes that will suit him. I found a shower seat and some old, clean jeans and a shirt that I thought he could wear. He would have to use his own shoes and underwear, but I wasn't too concerned about following fashion rules. I put it all in the downstairs bathroom and went back into the living room to help him get to the bathroom. When I had settled it, I sat down again in the living room. Where are we taking him? I asked my grandfather. To a place similar to where I took you, he said. He'll be safe there. We need to get this video to the authorities, Danny said as I prepared to burn it to DVD. And what should I tell them? I asked. That we saw a video of two people somewhere we don't know discussing the revolution and then having a night? We'll both be locked up in a mental hospital. You're right, she said. But Danny is right, Grandpa, I said. We have to do something. I understand how you feel, son, he said. I need to think about this. Saving a person from death in the desert is one thing, stopping an attempted revolution is another matter entirely. Let's get Lionel to safety first, and then we'll discuss this. Okay, Grandpa, I said. I excused myself for a minute, went to my office, and came back with a backpack. After another half hour, Lionel returned to the living room limping. He looked funny in his worn-out jeans that didn't fit him well and his expensive but ruined shoes, but at least he didn't smell anymore. Grandfather stood up as Lionel entered the room. Are you ready, son? He asked. I'm ready, Lionel replied, nodding his head. Grandfather went out and returned with a lasso. He circled it around us. Just as I expected. I'll be back as soon as I can, I said, kissing Danny and William. She smiled and kissed me back. You better come back, cowboy, she said. I stood next to Lionel, supporting him while Grandpa did his magic rope move. The next moment, we were standing in the middle of a dusty street very similar to the one where my grandfather took me when I ran into my first wife and her lover. Grandfather pointed to a 2-story wooden building with a sign that simply said hotel. I helped Lionel up the creaky steps onto the wooden sidewalk while Grandpa opened the door. The inside was much cooler than outside, and I felt like I had walked into a museum of the Old West. A bald man wearing an armband came out of the back room and greeted us. "Elijah, old friend," he said. "How are you?" Grandfather approached him, and they shook hands firmly. "I'm not complaining," said Grandfather. "How are you?" "Oh, the man replied with a wink, which made Grandfather smile. "Listen, Jake, can you shelter my friend for a while? Preferably on the first floor." "He was bitten by a snake," said Grandfather. Jake looked at Lionel and shook his head. "Yes, I think I can," he said. "Thank you," said Grandfather. "And maybe there will be suitable clothes and boots for him. Can you also teach him how to use a revolver?" Jake looked at Grandfather with narrowed eyes. "You're not going to start a shootout here, are you?" he asked. Grandfather shook his head. "I wouldn't do that to you, Jake," he said. Jake looked at Lionel for a moment before answering. "Well, if you can just keep him from scratching like a cow against the fence, I guess you can," he said. We looked and saw Lionel trying to scratch his back on the door frame. "What the hell is wrong with you, kid?" Grandfather asked. "Sorry, my back itches like crazy," he said. "I can't stop." "Pick up your shirt," I said, walking up behind Lionel. Lionel obeyed, and I saw a large red spot on his lower back. Taking a closer look, I noticed a small formation in the center of the spot, similar to a hair. Grandfather looked at it with me. "What is this?" "A bite?" he asked. "I've never seen a bite like that," I replied. I looked closer and noticed something under Lionel's skin. "I don't think it's a bite," I said. "Looks like they implanted some kind of tracking chip in him." "What?" Grandfather exclaimed. "Yes," I confirmed. "Remember what that man said in the video? They lost track of him a few hours after he was abandoned." "That's right," Grandfather agreed. "I thought they had people watching him in the desert." I shook my head. "Hardly," I said. "I need a blade and alcohol. We need to get this out. Looks like an infection is starting." Grandpa pulled a knife from his belt and handed it to me, then turned to Jake. "Do you have any alcohol, Jake?" he asked. The other man looked under the counter and pulled out a glass bottle. He gave it to Grandfather. "Here you go," he said. "You might need this too," he added, handing Grandfather a small wooden stick. "Thank you," said Grandfather. He handed me the alcohol and looked at Lionel. "It's probably going to hurt like hell," he said. "Use this, it will help, trust me." Lionel looked at the wand for a moment, then opened his mouth. Grandfather put the stick in his mouth, and he clenched it between his teeth. Using a knife, I took out the chip. After that, I examined the wound and saw that almost all the redness had disappeared. I poured in a little more alcohol, hoping it would help. I decided that he would be fine for a while, and if he got worse, I would ask Dr. Thompson to see him when we got back. I pulled his shirt down and stood up. "How are you feeling, Lionel?" I asked. He shook his head. "Much better," he said. "Thank you." We looked at the small device in my handkerchief. It was about twice the size of a grain of rice, black in color with tiny wires sticking out from both sides. "Is this a tracking device?" Grandfather asked. I nodded my head. "I think so," I said. "They most likely injected it into him after pilling him with something." I threw it on the floor and crushed it with my boot. Grandpa looked at Jake. "Where's his room?" he asked. Jake pointed down the hall. "Right there," he said. "The toilet is outside. He'll have to empty the potty himself." "Toilet? Potty?" asked Lionel. Jake laughed. "This isn't New York, man," he said. "If you want to eat, there's a place across the street, right next to the barber shop. You can shave and take a bath there if you want. Just say it's about AI." Lionel looked at us, stunned. "We'll explain later," I said. "Let's take you to your room." We thanked Jake and helped Lionel to his room. When we got inside, he looked around. There wasn't much there: a bed, a table with a bowl and a jug of water, and a closet in the corner. "What?" There's no TV? He asked. Where's the switch? What is this for? He asked, pointing to a large ceramic jug with a wide hole standing next to the nightstand. This is a chamber pot, I said. It's for peeing at night. Lionel turned pale at this. It won't work, he said. We sat him down on the bed. That's why I packed this for you, I said, placing the backpack on the bed. It's not much, but it will help you pass the time until we get back. I pulled out an old tablet and handed it to him. I have 2 seasons of NCIS and several movies loaded onto this tablet. The battery is fully charged, so that should be enough. If you don't end up watching everything, there's also a roll of toilet paper and something to grab a snack if you want. I also put a couple of magazines in. Thank you, he said. That will help. What about the light? Grandfather pointed to the kerosene lamp on the nightstand. That's what it's for, he said. Ever used one of these? Lionel shook his head. No, never, he said. Grandfather shook his head. Oh my God, man, he said. Let me show you. After a few minutes, Lionel figured out how to light the lamp. I can't believe people ever lived like this, Lionel said. Grandfather chuckled at this. Believe me, man, he said. And let me tell you, we were damn glad we had. How long will I be here? He asked. I hope not for long, I said. Grandfather nodded his head in agreement. We'll do everything we can to help you, son, he said. But when the time comes, you will have to do the main work. Do you think you can handle it? Lionel looked at his grandfather for a few seconds before slowly nodding his head. I think so, he said. Okay, said Grandfather. Listen to what Jake tells you, okay? And don't get into trouble. I promise, he said. Thank you both. Hang in there, Lionel. We'll get you through this, I said as I left the room. We reached the main hall of the hotel and said goodbye to Jake. Suddenly, Grandpa's eyes widened. We have to go now, son, he said. We ran outside, and he took out his rope, throwing it over us. We ended up in my living room. I looked around and saw that the front door was open. I called Danny, but she wasn't there. I didn't see William either. What's happened? I asked. They took Danny and William, he said. My heart sank for a moment, then I got angry, terribly angry. I swore they would pay for this. We looked at the table and saw a note with GPS coordinates and a time. You know who we are looking for, it was handwritten. Bring him to these coordinates at the specified time, and your wife and child will be released unharmed. Can you find this place? Grandfather asked. I nodded my head and turned on the computer. When it loaded, I found this place about 200 miles south of the Mexican border in Chihuahua. I looked at my watch. They're heading south of the border, I said. About 200 miles to Chihuahua. They give us less than 6 hours to be there. I have an idea, said Grandpa. Which is? I asked. Are you planning to hand Lionel over to them? He shook his head. No, he said. I don't think they'll let Danny and William go even if we hand Lionel over to them. Mr. Castillo thinks he's some kind of Napoleon. I think it's time for him to meet his Waterloo, and I know the people who can make it happen, he added with a sly smile. Tell you what, get your gun in order and ready. Then saddle up Ringo. We're going to have a little raid tonight. After he left, I cleaned my gun and made sure it was ready. Then I went outside and straddled Ringo, making sure he was ready too. When I finished and returned home, Grandfather had already returned. Are you ready? He asked. I nodded my head. Okay, don't forget your badge. I took the tin star from the mantelpiece and pinned it on my shirt. He smiled when he saw this. I don't want to go into battle without my assistant, he said, patting me on the shoulder. We got out, mounted our horses, and headed toward the clearing near Hawk Gulch. Are you ready? Grandfather asked. We'd done it once before, and I knew what was coming, but I'd gladly do it again if I could save my wife and son. I clenched my teeth and nodded my head. Let's do this, I said. He smiled and looked ahead. Forward, he shouted, spurring his horse. I followed him, determined to save my family. We headed toward the cliffs that bordered the gorge, and just as we were about to jump off the edge, a large dark passage opened up above the ground. We galloped through the passage and ended up on a grassy ridge. We continued driving and soon came across a large group of men in dark blue uniforms. We slowed to a stop and dismounted. A man with an unshaven beard and rather short hair came up to us and shook Grandfather's hand. I noticed oak leaves on his shoulders. "It's good to see you, Eli," he said. "Who is this young man?" he asked, looking at me. "This is my great-great-great-grandson, Amos Jones," said Grandfather. "Amos, this is Lieutenant Colonel Fielder Jones, commander of the 8th Indiana Cavalry." The colonel extended his hand to me, and I shook it. "Nice to meet you, Colonel," I said. He nodded. "It's nice to meet you," he said. "Jones, huh? Maybe we really are related." Grandfather laughed. "Perhaps, Colonel," he said. "I hope you don't mind, Eli, but I invited other participants to our little meeting," the colonel said. "Not at all," said Grandfather. "Okay," said the colonel. "Let me introduce you." A man in a light blue-gray jacket approached us. His beard was longer and thicker than any I had ever seen. He wore a small hat with one side turned up and a huge saber on his hip. He took off his gloves and extended his hand to Grandfather. "General Stewart," said Grandfather. "We finally met." "It's an honor, sir." "My honor, Sergeant," he said. "Who is this young man?" he asked, looking at me. "General, this is my great-great-great-grandson, Amos Jones," said Grandfather. "Amos, this is James U. Brown Stewart, one of the finest cavalry officers in the Confederate Army." "I'm very glad to meet you," I said. "I've read a lot about you." His smile broke through his thick beard. "I hope some of it was good," he said. "And please, call me Jeb." "Yes, sir," I said. Jeb turned to Colonel Jones. "So, what's your plan, Colonel?" he asked. Colonel Jones walked to a spot overlooking the bustling camp below. I saw a helicopter parked on the southern edge of the camp. "It's simple," he said. "Eli and Amos will make first contact." He pointed to an area to the right of the camp. 3 companies of the 8th will attack their left flank. I will be in the center with 3 companies and a battery of artillery. I would appreciate it if you and your men would attack their right flank over there, he added, pointing to the opposite side of the camp. There's a good position there, and they're not expecting you. Eli will give the signal. Once he does, I'll order the artillery to make a few strikes to disorient them, then we'll attack. Jeb nodded, scanning the area. "What about the southern approach?" Jeb asked. "The Mexican army is approaching from the south," Colonel Jones said. "They're still a few miles away, but I figure these guys will run as soon as it starts, and they'll run south as fast as they can." "Why do you think so?" Colonel Jeb asked. "First of all, they are not Mexican regulars," he said. "Most of these guys look like new recruits, perhaps pulled straight from the streets or straight from prison. Little or no training, no discipline. If they're not drinking, they're eating or sleeping. Not exactly my idea of a fighting force." "Fair," Jeb said. "Wait, Colonel," I said. "My wife and child are in this camp. I don't want them to get hit by artillery." "Well, if everything goes as I predict, Danny and William will get out of there before we attack," Grandpa said. "Also, the guns are aimed to shoot over their heads," Colonel Jones said. "The shells will land just south of the camp. We shoot to distract them. Don't worry, these gunners are the best of the best. Your wife and child will be fine." "I hope so, Colonel," I said. Jeb joined us as we turned to return to our horses. "Colonel Jones never told me what this was all about," he said. "Would you like to explain?" "Same as always," I said. "Guns, power, money, and of course, lawyers are involved too." "Of course," he said. "Only this time, they kidnapped my wife and little son," I said, "and I intend to return them." "I understand," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes to make it happen, son," he said, shaking my hand. "Thank you, General," I said. As we returned to our horses, I heard a violin playing softly in the background and men in gray jackets singing a song. It had a catchy melody, and I stopped to listen for a second. Now every cavalryman who loves honor and rightness, let him follow Stuart's pen tonight. Tighten your straps and loosen your reins, pull up the blanket and fasten the holster again. Check the click of your trigger and the balance of your blade, because whoever goes on a raid must ride confidently. A catchy tune, I said to my grandfather when the violin began to play. What's it called? Raid, said grandfather. An old Confederate cavalry song. Did you ever sing like that during the war? I asked. He nodded. Many times, he said. Remember, we didn't have all these newfangled things that you have now. We created our own entertainment. We are 3,000 horses, and not one is afraid. We are 3,000 sabers, and not one is stupid. The men sang as my grandfather and I mounted our horses. For some reason, I felt even more confident that we would succeed. Are you ready to do this? Grandfather asked. I was born ready, Grandpa, I joked. He looked at me a little strangely before his face broke into a smile. Let's do this, he said. We waved goodbye to Colonel Jones as we left camp. He waved back and turned to his men. Grandpa, I don't understand something, I said as we rode. What exactly, son? He asked. Aren't you and General Stuart enemies during the war? I asked. He nodded. Yes, we fought on opposite sides during the war, he said, but I always respected him. You know, he had a distinguished military career even before the war began. Besides, we stopped being enemies a long time ago. Remember, for both of us, the war was over before it was officially over. I thought about his words as we passed a group of cannons and headed straight for Castillo's camp. A few minutes later, we were stopped by a man with a machine gun. Stop, the man ordered. What do you need? We are here to meet with your leader, Enrique Castillo, said grandfather. He's waiting for us. Holding his weapon pointed in our direction, he shouted to someone behind him. What is he saying? Grandfather, I asked. He called someone to bring Castillo, grandfather said. The man turned to us again and nervously continued to hold his weapon at us until another man in a shiny uniform with large round epaulets and medals on his chest approached us. Are you Castillo? Grandfather asked. Yes, I am Enrique Castillo, General of the Army of New Chihuahua and future Emperor of Latin America, the man said in English. Who are you and what do you need? My name is Justice Opis, said Grandpa, and this is my second in command, Amos Jones. We are here to take the woman and child you kidnapped today. Then we will take you with us. Enrique laughed. We thought you were coming by helicopter, he said with a grin, but you arrived on horses. How did you get here so quickly, and where's the person you were supposed to bring? Our horses are faster, I said. The man you were looking for is safe from you, but you will see him soon, said grandfather. And what if I decide not to give up the woman and her child? Enrique asked. Then I'll have to introduce you to my friends, said Grandpa. Enrique's eyes widened when he saw a mass of dark blue uniforms on horses that suddenly appeared behind us. The men next to him were also stunned. I looked back and saw flames coming from the nostrils of some of the horses, and the men had already drawn their sabers. Who are these people? What kind of magic is this? Enrique asked. As I said, these are my friends, said Grandfather, his eyes lighting up with fire. Meet the 8th Indiana Cavalry, reinforced by Jeb Stuart's cavalry veterans of many battles. You wanted a war, didn't you? I'll be glad to give you one. You won't believe. By then, the woman I knew as Cheryl, Lionel's wife, appeared on the scene. Her face turned white when she saw the ghostly cavalryman behind us. She turned to us. Where's my husband? She demanded. In a safe place, said Grandfather. Now bring the woman and her child. Enrique looked at Cheryl. Do it, he said. But Enrique, she began. Just do it, he barked. She turned and gave orders to the two men behind her. A minute later, Danny was led outside. One of the men with her held William in his arms and handed him to her. As they stood in front of us, I asked, Are you okay? She nodded. "We're fine," she said. "They didn't touch us. We just arrived here." Grandpa pulled out his rope and threw it over Danny. I whispered to her, "I love you." She responded in kind before disappearing. Enrique looked at me before speaking. "Oh, so you're this woman's husband, aren't you?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Well then, it's a good thing you showed up, otherwise, my people would have thought she would be useful for entertainment," he said, laughing. Cheryl laughed with him. Grandpa swung the rope again, wrapping it around Enrique and Cheryl. They froze in place, but I noticed that Enrique had wet himself. I couldn't help laughing. "What a general!" Grandpa pulled the rope, and they disappeared in a cloud of smoke. Grandpa let out a piercing whistle, the loudest I had ever heard. Before anyone could react, the ground shook, and the cannons opened fire, sending shells over our heads that exploded south of the camp. One of the shells hit the helicopter, and it exploded in flames. I heard the sound of a trumpet signaling a charge on my right side, and on my left, I heard what might be taken for cries of rebellion as 2 columns of cavalry charged the flanks of the camp. The men behind us advanced, their sabers drawn. A few minutes later, I saw several of Castillo's men drop their weapons and run south to escape the carnage. Soon, the enemy fire ceased, and a thick cloud of acrid smoke hung over the destroyed camp like fog. The cavalrymen silently left the camp, leaving behind the chaos they had created. Colonel Jones looked at me as he left the camp. I waved to him and gave him a thumbs up. He smiled, returned the gesture, and saluted before riding off. To my left, I saw Jeb Stewart on his horse. He saluted with an open palm, and Grandpa returned the favor. I waved my hand to him, and he answered. Seconds later, he and his men were gone, leaving no trace but my memory in the ruined camp before me. Stunned, I put my gun back in its holster. I couldn't believe what had just happened. It was difficult to describe my emotions at that moment. I stood there leaning on Ringo, collecting my thoughts when I felt a strong hand on my shoulder. I looked and saw my grandfather staring at me. "Are you okay, son?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes, I think so," I said. "You did well, son," he said. "I'm proud of you. Now, why don't we get out of here before the whole Mexican army shows up?" "Sounds good," I said. We mounted our horses and headed back the way we had come. A familiar passage opened, and the next moment we found ourselves on a dusty road leading to a familiar border town. We stopped at the hotel and tied the horses to a post in front of the entrance. Danny threw herself into my arms as soon as I entered the hotel, showering me with kisses. I held her tightly, returning her kisses. "Are you okay?" I asked. She nodded. I saw Jake bouncing little William on his lap, and I knew from his laughter that he was fine now. "Yes," she said. "What happened?" "Shortly after you and Grandpa left, a helicopter landed outside the house, and a bunch of armed men stormed the house," she said. "They were looking for Lionel. I tried to tell them that I didn't know such a thing, but they didn't believe me. They took us both away, and that woman wrote you a note. We only arrived at that camp half an hour before you showed up." "Did they hurt you?" I asked. She shook her head. "They just didn't have time to do anything," she said. "But this Castillo said that if you don't show up at the appointed time, he will give me to his people." I didn't have to guess what they were going to do with her and William. I saw Lionel sitting on a chair against the wall. "How is he?" I asked. "He seems to be doing better," Danny said. "At least he can walk a little." "Okay," said Grandpa. "He can go to jail with us." "Are you going to put him in jail?" asked Danny. Grandpa shook his head. "No," he said. "Castillo and Cheryl are there now." He looked at Lionel. "Ready to meet your wife?" he asked. Lionel nodded and patted the gun he had in his holster. "Ready," he said. "Then let's go," said Grandpa. Lionel stood up from his chair, and we turned to leave. "Wait," Danny said. "If you are going to meet them, then I will go with you. I have a score to settle with them too." "I think you'd better stay here with William," Grandpa said. Danny shook her head. "No," she said. "They kidnapped my child and put him in danger." I can't let them get away with this." Grandpa knew that it was useless to argue with Danny when she was determined. He nodded and looked at Jake, who seemed engrossed in playing with little William. "Would you mind looking after my grandson for a little while?" he asked. Jake smiled and looked up. "My pleasure, Eli," he said. "I haven't held a baby in my arms for a long time." "He looks a lot like Jed, doesn't he?" "Yes, it looks like it," said Grandpa. "Okay, let's go," he added, turning around. On the way, I stopped and grabbed my gun from its holster. We headed to the prison and saw Enrique and Cheryl sitting in a cell. Grandpa looked at the sheriff and motioned for him to open the cell door. "Are you sure about this?" Eli asked the sheriff. "I'm sure," Grandpa said as the sheriff opened the cell door. "Do I need to stay?" asked the sheriff. "Then I'll figure it out myself," said Grandpa. "My deputy will cover for me. Why don't you go get some food?" The sheriff nodded. "I won't refuse," he said as he left. "Okay, you too," Grandpa said. He added, gesturing for them to exit. They looked at each other for a moment, then slowly stood up. "Cheryl, I made it clear to them not to contact us." Grandpa laughed, looking at us. "You must understand that it is dangerous to come between a mother and her child," he told her. He turned to Castillo. "Well, General," he said sarcastically, "you have to understand that your nice little war is over." He turned to Lionel. "Do you have anything to discuss with your wife?" he asked. Lionel pulled up a chair and looked at his wife. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't kill you right now," he asked. She looked at him in shock. "Because I love you," she said quietly. He laughed, and Castillo looked at her in surprise. "That's right," said Lionel. "That's why you left me to die in the desert, right? That's why you tried to set me up and had an affair with that imposter dictator, isn't it? I'm glad you love me, though. I wouldn't want to know what you would have done with me if I didn't love you, you lying." Castillo making sound through the pain. "You told me you didn't love him anymore and wanted to be my queen. You swore loyalty to me. I told you what I would do if you betrayed me." He rushed at her. We were all surprised when we heard the shot. He fell to the floor, dead, and then he disappeared. We looked at Lionel, who was holding a gun. "Where did he go?" Cheryl asked. "To your eternal refuge," said Grandpa. Cheryl looked at Lionel, who was still holding the gun. "You killed him," she gasped. "Maybe you'd rather I let him strangle you," Lionel said. "So tell me, why did you do this? Why did you cheat on me with him? Why did you plan to kill me?" "Because," she said, "he was rich and powerful. He was ambitious. He was a megalomaniac liar, just like you." Lionel said, "So what are you going to do? Kill me too?" she asked. "It's tempting," Lionel said, "but I have an idea." While Jake was showing me how to use it, he looked at his grandfather. "Tell me, is it possible to escape from here?" Grandpa shook his head. "Normally, no," he said. "Why do you ask?" "Do you know the myth of Prometheus?" asked Lionel. "I remember this old story from Greek mythology," said Grandpa. Cheryl looked at Lionel, confused. "Let me explain," he began. "Prometheus gave people fire and taught them blacksmithing. For this, Zeus chained him to a rock and sent an eagle every day to peck his liver. Every night, the liver grew back, and the eagle came again the next day. This continued for many years until Hercules killed the eagle with his arrow. And what does this mean for me?" Cheryl asked. "You left me to die in the desert with nothing," Lionel said. "You told me to do humanity a favor and die." Her eyes widened in horror as Lionel turned to his grandfather. "Do you think something like this could be arranged for her?" His grandfather narrowed his eyes as he considered the proposal. "You can't do this to me." Cheryl pleaded. "Please, Lionel, divorce me if you want, but don't leave me." "Shut up," Lionel responded. "You know as well as I do that the courts will side with you in any divorce. That's why I will not divorce you. I will wait as long as it takes for you to be declared dead." She recoiled when she heard this. "I'll run away from here," she said. "I will find you, you know I will, and I will make you pay for it." No, you won't find it, said Grandpa. He looked at Lionel. I see what you're getting at. It's unusual, but not completely out of the question. Are you absolutely sure of your decision? Lionel looked him in the eyes and replied, I'm absolutely sure. I want her to feel the pain she caused me. Grandpa nodded. Okay. The next moment, we found ourselves in the middle of the desert next to a large rock. There was sand and bushes everywhere. Cheryl was chained, without anything, chained to a rock, her arms and legs spread apart. She looked around in horror and fear. Are you really going to leave me here? She screamed. I'll die here. That's what you were going to do to me, Lionel said. But I loved you unconditionally. Actually, said Grandpa, you will not die here. You will remain here alive, chained to this rock until you are declared dead, no matter how long it takes. Then you will go to your eternal resting place. Vultures will fly to you from time to time, and wild animals will come to you. You will recover just enough to survive the next visit. Food will appear every morning, just enough to keep you alive. You will be completely alone. Do you know the saying, an eye for an eye? Please. You can't do this to me, she begged when she realized the meaning of his words. Give me another chance, Lionel. I beg you. If your husband sees that you have sincerely repented and he wants to show mercy, he can ask for your release, said Grandpa. She looked at Lionel, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry it ended like this, he said, repeating her own words. I'm sure I'll find someone who's much better in bed than you. She started crying as we walked away from the rock. The next second, we were back at the hotel. Lionel looked a little shocked by what had just happened. Danny and I exchanged stunned looks. Do you think she'll ever have real remorse? Lionel asked his grandfather. It's possible if she doesn't go crazy first, said Grandpa. He took the red stone ring out of his pocket and handed it to Lionel. Watch this stone. When you see it begin to flicker blue, it will mean that she has sincerely repented. If you want to free her, press the stone. Lionel looked at the ring for a moment before placing it on his finger. I'll keep an eye on her every day, he said. Did I do the right thing? Sometimes people have to hit rock bottom before they change, Grandpa said. Have you ever heard the story of Jonah? Yes, said Lionel. Didn't he get swallowed by a whale or something? Something like that, said Grandpa. He refused to do what God wanted him to do and even ran in the opposite direction. So God sent a huge fish to swallow him. He sat in the belly of this fish for 3 days and 3 nights, praying until he repented. The fish spat him out onto dry land, and Jonah finally did what he had to do. You know, he must have looked terrible and smelled even worse by then. Maybe your wife needs a similar lesson too. The real question is whether you can. Will you ever let go of your hatred and forgive her? Lionel shook his head. I don't know, he said quietly. After all, she tried to kill me. Yes, I tried, said Grandpa. Okay, he said after a few seconds. It's time to go home. We packed our things and headed to the ranch. I gave Lionel my address and cell phone number in case he wanted to talk to me, and Grandpa drove him home. Danny fed William and put him to bed. Tired, I took a beer and went out into the backyard to smoke. After a while, Danny joined me. It's so good to finally be home with you, she said, burying her face in my shoulder. I hugged her tightly. Yes, it is, I said. I'm just grateful that you and William are okay. I don't know how I would get through it if I lost either of you. You know I was scared, but I wasn't worried, she said, taking a drag from my cigarette. I knew you and Grandpa would save us, and you did. I put out the cigarette and took her beautiful face in my hands. I kissed her like never before. I love you so much, I told her. I love you more, my husband, she replied. We heard a cough from behind the door. We sat up, alarmed, and looked around. Sorry to interrupt you guys, Grandpa said, smiling. I just wanted to let you know that I got Lionel home safely. It's no big deal, Danny said. How is he, by the way? I think he'll be okay in time, Grandpa said. He's been through a lot. We had a good talk about everything. We'll see how it goes. Do you think you will ever forgive his wife? I asked. I don't know, said Grandpa. He's very angry right now, and he has a right to be. I told him to stay in touch with you, and he said he would. Look, I know you need some time alone, so I'll go. Danny jumped up and rushed toward him before he could leave, hugging him. What is this for? He asked. I just wanted to thank you and tell you I love you, she said, kissing his cheek. He smiled, looking at her. I love you too, Danny, he said, hugging her back. Now take care of my grandchildren, both of them, do you hear? I will, Grandpa, I promise. Say hi to Grandma Lizzie and give her our love, she said. He nodded. I'll pass it on, he said. See you later. He added, touching the brim of his hat. After he left, Danny came back to me. So where are we? She asked with a playful smile on her face. A few days after that incident, I came across a short article on the internet about a foiled coup attempt in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. A Mexican army colonel named Alejandro Ruz was singled out for killing a wealthy businessman who was raising an army with the goal of taking over the state and eventually the entire country. Some of the captured men claimed that they were attacked by demons on horseback. Ruz rejected these claims as delusions caused by illegal substances. He also said that during the raid on the camp, evidence of illegal weapons supply was discovered. The weapons were confiscated, and Mexican authorities said they were investigating to identify all those involved. Initial reports suggested that a lawyer from a Southern California-based company was involved in the case, but that lawyer had not yet been named. Ruz was promoted to brigadier general, received a medal, and was recognized as a national hero. The news did not mention any cavalry attack. Fortunately, Lionel stayed in touch with me and told me that he had filed a missing persons report for Cheryl, mainly to cover his tracks if he decided to divorce her in absentia. He also started seeing a psychologist. About a year later, he called to say that the stone in the ring he was wearing had started flashing blue. By then, we had a daughter, Elizabeth. Lionel said he followed his grandfather's instructions and pressed the stone. Grandpa soon delivered a thin, emaciated, hysterical woman to his house. Lionel said he washed her up and tried to help her adapt to society again but had little success. She barely spoke, refused to wear clothes most of the time, and ate as if every meal was her last. He even had to reteach her how to use the toilet like a child. Moreover, it took her several weeks before she could walk more than a few steps. He allowed her to stay out of pity, not wanting to throw her out into society until he was sure she could survive on her own. I heard from him several times over the next months, and one day he called to say that she was no longer there. She left home, I asked. No, Lionel said, crying. She died. I thought she was starting to get better. I came home from the office and found her in bed. She had taken sleeping pills. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. It's normal, he said. Your grandfather said that she had finally made peace with God and was ready to leave. She wrote a rather lengthy manuscript that explains a lot of things. It is quite graphic in places. She also left a will in which she bequeathed to me all her property, more than $5 million in an offshore account. I never knew she had that kind of money. Perhaps this was her way of apologizing to me. Wow, I said. Would you like to read her manuscript? He asked. Yes, of course, if you don't mind, I said. I don't mind, he said. I'll have to go through it and correct some mistakes. She spent the last few months writing this, and her thoughts are hard to make out in places. This will take some time, probably about 3 weeks. Take your time, don't rush. Are you okay? I asked. Yeah, I'm fine, he said. The last few months have opened up old wounds, but I can handle it. Take care of yourself, I said, and stay in touch. I will, he said. And thank you again for everything. You're welcome, I replied. We ended the call, and I told Danny what Lionel said. It's a shame, she said, but I'd be interested in reading what she wrote. I have to admit that I was curious too, but I decided we could wait 3 weeks. We looked into the yard and saw William riding on Grandpa's back like a horse while Elizabeth giggled and squealed. I enjoyed watching Grandpa on all fours pretend to be a horse, making neigh sounds while William rode on his back. It was difficult to know who enjoyed the game more, William or Grandpa. I looked at Danny and saw a look of love on her face. Kissing her sweet face made me realize how happy I really was. What do you think of our story today? I think the revenge from my husband was just right. I liked it the best. What's your opinion? Write in the comments. See you in the next video.